In 1999, while working as a rescuer during one of the worst floods in our area, I saw something that shouldn't exist. And I'm not alone. There have been many reports of a strange humanoid giant beast saving people. I still find it hard to believe after so many years, but Bigfoot exists, and it saved people. I've been a firefighter for 20 years, and after 2 decades of pulling people from burning buildings, cutting victims out of mangled cars, and responding to every kind of emergency imaginable, I thought nothing could surprise me anymore. I'd seen structure fires that melted steel beams, traffic accidents that defied the laws of physics in their brutality, medical emergencies that tested every ounce of training I possessed. I'd held the hands of dying people, delivered babies in the backs of ambulances, talked suicidal individuals down from bridges. In this line of work, you develop a thick skin and a certainty that you've seen everything humanity and nature can throw at you. You become confident in your ability to handle whatever comes next because you've already survived so much. But what happened during the flood of 1999 shattered that confidence completely and rebuilt it into something I'm still trying to understand. What I witnessed during those 3 chaotic days still keeps me up at night, not because it was frightening in the traditional sense, but because it was so utterly impossible that I can barely wrap my mind around it even now, all these years later. Our town sits right along a river that usually flows calm and peaceful through the valley. It's the kind of river you'd see in postcards, with clear water running over smooth stones, kids swimming in the summer, families having picnics on its banks. Most days you can wade across it without getting your knees wet. The deepest parts might reach your waist if you're not particularly tall. It's a friendly river, or at least it was until that spring. In March of 1999, after weeks of heavy rain upstream in the mountains, weeks where it seemed like the sky forgot how to stop pouring water, that gentle river turned into something unrecognizable. It became a monster that swallowed everything in its path. The water rose 15 feet overnight. 15 feet. I still have trouble comprehending that number even though I saw it with my own eyes. One day the river was running high but manageable, maybe a foot or 2 above normal. The next morning, entire neighborhoods that had stood for generations were underwater. Streets became rivers themselves, cars floated past houses like toys in a bathtub, and families found themselves trapped on roofs in their pajamas, desperately waiting for help that seemed like it might never come. The transformation was so sudden, so complete, that it felt like we'd woken up in a different world entirely. I was part of the emergency response team that worked around the clock for 3 days straight. We barely slept, maybe grabbing an hour here or there when the exhaustion became too much to fight. We survived on coffee that tasted like motor oil and cold sandwiches that volunteers handed us between rescues. The adrenaline kept us going when our bodies wanted to shut down. We navigated boats through what used to be residential streets, pulling people to safety one at a time, sometimes 2 if we could manage it safely. The elderly were especially vulnerable, unable to climb to their attics or onto their roofs, trapped in rooms as the water rose inch by terrifying inch. Communication systems were down across most of the affected area. Power was out across half the county. We had no comprehensive idea of how many people were still trapped or missing. We were working blind, going street by street, house by house, calling out and hoping someone would call back. It was chaos in the purest sense of the word. The kind of chaos where you can't think beyond the next rescue, the next person who needs help. You operate on pure instinct and training, your mind shutting down everything that isn't immediately essential to keeping people alive. Every minute counted, every decision mattered. The weight of that responsibility was crushing, but you don't have time to feel crushed when someone's life depends on you acting right now. The The second night of the flood, my team and I were navigating the flooded streets in a rescue boat at dusk. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting this eerie orange glow over everything. The water reflected that light back up, creating strange patterns that hurt to look at directly. The whole scene had this surreal quality to it, like we were operating in a dream or on some alien planet. It didn't feel like our town anymore. The familiar landmarks were distorted or hidden. The streets we'd driven down thousands of times were unrecognizable under feet of murky water. We were searching a neighborhood on the east side of town where several residents had been reported missing by family members who'd managed to evacuate. The neighborhood was one of the older parts of town, with houses built in the 40s and 50s, solid construction that was now being tested beyond what anyone had designed it for. The silence in that area was unsettling in a way I can't quite describe. It was broken only by the gentle lapping of water against aluminum siding and the occasional creak of a house settling under the strain. No bird singing, no dogs barking, no sound of traffic or human activity. Just water and emptiness, and the knowledge that somewhere in this drowned landscape people were waiting for us to find them. We made the decision to split up to cover more ground. Time was critical, and we could search more houses faster if we worked independently. My partner took the main street while I navigated my boat down a side street, moving slowly past houses that looked like they were drowning. The water reached up to the second-floor windows on some of them. Cars floated past like toys in a bathtub, bumping gently against each other or drifting in lazy circles. I could see belongings drifting by in the current, photo albums with their pages fanned open, children's toys, a kitchen table, a rocking chair, somebody's wedding dress still in its preservation box. It was heartbreaking to see people's entire lives just washing away, decades of memories and possessions reduced to floating debris. I was calling out every few seconds, my voice getting hoarse from the effort. "Hello? Fire department? Is anyone there? Can anyone hear me?" The words echoed off the houses and came back to me hollow and empty. I was beginning to think this particular street had been evacuated successfully when I heard something that made me stop dead in the water, my hand frozen on the throttle. The sound was like heavy splashing, rhythmic and purposeful, too steady and too regular to be debris hitting something or an animal moving through the water. At first, I thought maybe another rescue boat had come around from a different street, that another team had entered this neighborhood from a different access point. But I didn't see any lights, and our boats were loud with motors that you could hear from blocks away. This was different. The splashing had a distinct pattern to it, almost like footsteps, but much heavier, and it seemed to be moving toward the deeper water instead of away from it, which didn't make any sense at all. I turned the boat slowly, careful not to create a wake that might damage the already stressed structures around me. I rounded the corner where an old 2-story house stood half submerged, its front porch completely underwater, water reaching up to the second-floor windows and lapping at the sills. The house's paint was peeling from water damage that had happened in just a day, and I could see curtains floating inside through the broken windows. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards ahead, moving through chest-deep water with complete ease, with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large, was something massive. At first glance, my brain tried to categorize it as another rescuer, maybe someone from a neighboring county's team that we hadn't been briefed about, maybe someone who'd come to help without going through official channels. But as my spotlight caught it for just a second, just the briefest flash of illumination, I realized with a jolt of pure shock that this was no person I'd ever seen before. The figure was walking upright on 2 legs like a human, but everything else about it was wrong. It stood easily 7 or 8 feet tall, maybe more, with shoulders so broad they seemed impossible, like a linebacker multiplied by 2. Its entire body was covered in dark fur that looked slick and wet, matted down by the water but still clearly thick and dense. The arms were longer than human proportions would allow, and they swung as it walked with a gait that was humanoid but distinctly different. What really caught my attention, what made my breath stop in my throat, was what it was carrying. Cradled in its massive arms was something large and limp, clearly human-shaped. Definitely a person. The figure moved with surprising gentleness despite its size, keeping whatever it carried close to its chest, high above the waterline, supporting the full weight as if it was nothing at all. I was so shocked that I just sat there in my boat, hand frozen on the spotlight switch, my mind struggling to process what my eyes were seeing. Every instinct I had was screaming that this couldn't be real, that I was hallucinating from exhaustion or stress. But the figure was there, solid and real, moving through the water with clear purpose. Before I could even begin to process what I was witnessing, the figure turned its head slightly in my direction, as if it had sensed my light or felt my gaze. For just a fraction of a second, I thought I saw its face, or at least the suggestion of a face, but it was too far away and the light was too brief. Then it moved with incredible speed that didn't match its size, ducking behind a partially submerged house and disappearing from view completely. The whole encounter lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it felt like time had stopped entirely, like the world had paused just to show me something impossible. I stared at the spot where it had vanished, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it over the sound of the water and the idle of my boat motor. My hands were shaking on the throttle. I felt cold despite the spring air, cold from the inside out. I told myself I was seeing things, that my mind was playing tricks. 3 days of no sleep would do that to anyone. The stress of the rescues, watching people lose everything they owned, pulling children from rooftops, the weight of knowing that every decision I made could mean life or death. All of it could have been combining to create hallucinations. Maybe it was just a really tall rescuer wearing dark rain gear, and the shadows and the angle of my light had distorted what I was seeing into something impossible. That's what I kept telling myself as I continued my patrol of the area, checking houses, calling out, doing my job. But I couldn't shake the image from my mind. The way it moved through the water like the current wasn't even there. The size of it, the impossible size, the care with which it carried that person like they were precious cargo that needed to be protected. None of it fit with any logical explanation I could come up with, no matter how hard I tried to force it into a framework that made sense. By early morning on the 3rd day, exhaustion was really setting in for all of us. The adrenaline could only carry you so far before your body started demanding rest that you couldn't afford to take. I was stationed at the temporary shelter we'd set up in the high school gym, taking a short break to file reports and grab some food. The gym was packed wall to wall with survivors, families huddled on cots that volunteers had brought in, children crying, adults trying to process the shock of losing their homes. Volunteers were distributing blankets and hot meals, moving through the rows with practiced efficiency. Medical staff were checking everyone for injuries, hypothermia, shock, making sure people were physically okay even if they weren't emotionally ready to deal with what had happened. I was sitting at a folding table, filling out paperwork about the previous night's rescues, when I heard a commotion near the entrance. My pen stopped mid-word as I looked up to see what was happening. A group of volunteers had just brought in an elderly woman who looked confused but physically unharmed. She was wrapped in one of our emergency blankets, the silver kind that crinkles when you move, and she kept looking around like she didn't know where she was or how she'd gotten there. Her white hair was still damp and she was shivering slightly despite the blanket. She looked to be in her 70s or 80s, frail in the way that elderly people sometimes are, And I remember thinking how lucky we were that she'd survived, that somehow she'd made it out of whatever house she'd been trapped in. One of the medical staff sat down with her on a cot to check her vitals and get her story. I was standing close enough to overhear, even though I was trying to focus on my reports. She was talking in a wavering voice, clearly still in shock, but trying her best to explain what had happened to her. What she said made the hair on the back of my neck stand up straight. She kept insisting that a big man had carried her from her attic to the church steps 3 blocks away. She said she'd been trapped in her attic as the water rose, terrified and alone with no way to call for help. She'd been up there for hours as the water crept higher, as the heat built up under the roof until she could barely breathe. She'd passed out from the heat and fear, certain she was going to die up there. The next thing she knew, she was waking up on the dry steps of the Methodist church with absolutely no memory of how she'd gotten there, no recollection of anyone finding her or carrying her or helping her in any way. The medical staff member was gentle but skeptical, asking her to describe who had helped her. The woman's description made my coffee cup freeze halfway to my lips. She said he was covered in dark hair from head to toe, that his hands were gentle despite being enormous, and that he never said a single word the entire time. She said she remembered the feeling of being lifted, the sensation of movement through water, and the warmth of the body carrying her even though the water was cold. But she couldn't see a face clearly, couldn't provide any detail that would help identify a specific person. The medical staff exchanged glances over her head, clearly thinking she was disoriented from possible hypothermia or shock-induced confusion. One of them gently suggested she might have been confused about the sequence of events, that maybe she'd floated on debris and her mind had filled in the gaps with false memories. But she was adamant, almost angry at the suggestion. She knew what she had experienced. She could still feel those hands lifting her carefully from her attic, the steady rhythm of movement through the water, the warmth of the body that carried her through the cold flood. I sat there completely frozen, my untouched sandwich getting cold on the paper plate in front of me. My mind immediately went back to what I'd seen the night before, that massive figure moving through the water with something in his arms. Could it have been the same thing? Had I actually witnessed this woman being carried to safety? Had I seen the moment when she was being rescued by whatever that creature was? The logical part of my brain was screaming that this was impossible, that humans don't come covered in hair, that nothing that large and powerful should exist without us knowing about it. We were all exhausted and traumatized. We'd been watching people lose everything they owned, pulling children from rooftops, making split-second decisions that could mean life or death. All of it could have been combining to create mass hallucinations or shared delusions. But another part of me, the part that had been doing this job long enough to trust my instincts even when they didn't make logical sense, was telling me something very real was happening here. I didn't say anything to anyone about what I'd seen. How could I? I could barely believe it myself, and I knew exactly how it would sound if I started telling people I'd seen some kind of giant hairy creature carrying people through the flood. They'd think I'd lost it completely, that the stress had finally broken something in my mind. They'd probably pull me off duty, send me for a psychological evaluation, maybe even recommend I take extended leave. My credibility as a first responder would be destroyed, so I kept my mouth shut and went back to work. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The image of that figure was burned into my mind, playing on repeat every time I closed my eyes. That afternoon, I was back on water patrol with a different partner, someone from another station who'd come to help with the emergency response. We were working our way through a neighborhood that had been particularly hard hit when the radio crackled to life with an urgent call. A family that had been evacuated was reporting their child was missing, swept away when they'd been fleeing their home. The panic in the dispatcher's voice was clear, even through the static. Every available team converged on the area to search. Boats coming from all directions, people calling out the child's name over and over. Parents, don't forget the sound of that kind of desperation. I'll carry those voices with me forever. We spent over an hour combing through the flooded streets, calling out the child's name until our voices were raw, checking every roof and every piece of high ground we could find. The water was still deep enough to hide debris underneath, making navigation dangerous. We had to move slowly, carefully, checking every possible place a small child might have ended up. We were starting to lose hope, starting to think we might be looking for a body instead of a living child, when I spotted something on the roof of a garden shed about 30 yards away. It was a small figure wrapped in what looked like a blue tarp, positioned right in the center of the shed's roof. My heart jumped into my throat. I radioed my position immediately, and we approached as carefully as we could, not wanting to create any waves that might disturb the shed or knock the child off if they were injured and unconscious. When we got close enough, we found the missing kid lying there, completely unconscious but breathing steadily. The child was carefully wrapped in the tarp like a burrito, positioned well above the waterline, showing no signs of serious injury beyond some scrapes and bruises on the arms and legs. The way the child was wrapped showed care, showed intention. Someone had taken the time to make sure this kid was warm and protected. We carefully lifted the child into our boat and rushed back to where our medical team was set up. The parents were hysterical with relief when they saw us coming, crying and screaming and trying to climb into our boat before we'd even docked it properly. They were thanking every first responder they could find, grabbing our hands, hugging us, completely overwhelmed with the emotion of having their child back alive. The medical team took over, checking the child's vitals, getting oxygen going, warming them up slowly. The kid was going to be fine, they said, cold and traumatized, but fine. A miracle, really, considering everything. While the family was reuniting and the medical team was working, I went back to examine the shed roof more carefully. Something about the whole situation felt off in a way I couldn't put my finger on. How had the child gotten up there? The shed was at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. There was no ladder anywhere nearby, no debris that could have served as a ramp or a way to climb up. The water wasn't high enough for the child to have floated up there. And the tarp, where had that come from? It wasn't the kind of emergency blanket we used. It was a regular blue construction tarp, wrapped snugly around the child like someone had taken great care to keep them warm and safe and positioned just right. That's when I noticed the handprints in the mud on top of the shed roof. The sun was hitting them at just the right angle to make them clearly visible. They were enormous, easily twice the size of my own hands when I held mine up for comparison. Each finger was clearly defined in the dried mud, showing incredible detail. The prints suggested hands that were not just large but powerful, with thick fingers that had pressed deep into the mud. My partner had climbed up to help me document the scene, and we both stood there on that shed roof, staring at those prints without saying a word. The silence stretched between us, heavy with implications neither of us wanted to voice. Then I noticed more prints in the shallow water nearby, leading away from the shed toward the deeper floodwaters. We used a measuring tape to document them before they could be washed away. The prints were massive, showing 5 distinct toes, much wider than any human foot I'd ever seen. The stride length was impossible, showing whatever made them was at least 7 or 8 feet tall and had taken steps that covered more distance than any human could manage without running. And these weren't running prints, they were walking prints, regular and even, showing a creature that moved through the flooded landscape like it belonged there. My partner looked at me with wide eyes that reflected my own shock and confusion. We both knew what we were seeing didn't make any sense according to everything we thought we knew about the world. He opened his mouth like he was going to say something, then closed it again and shook his head slowly. What could either of us say? What words could possibly capture what we were looking at? We took some photos for the official report with the disposable camera we kept in the rescue kit, documenting the scene from multiple angles. But when it came time to write up our findings, we didn't mention the handprints or the strange footprints. What would we even say? That we found evidence of some kind of giant helping rescue victims? That something impossible had apparently saved a child's life? We'd be laughed out of the department or sent for mandatory psychological evaluation. So we wrote a simple report. Child found on shed roof, wrapped in tarp, unknown good Samaritan presumed responsible. And we left it at that. That evening back at the shelter, I started paying much closer attention to the conversations around me. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop exactly, but I found myself drawn to the survivors' stories, listening for any detail that might explain what was going on or confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. And what I heard made my blood run cold, not from fear, but from the realization that something much bigger than I'd imagined was happening all around us. Multiple people throughout the shelter were describing similar experiences. I moved through the rows of cots, pretending to check on people, actually listening to their stories with new ears. A middle-aged man with a bushy beard was telling his family he'd woken up on a picnic table in the park. The last thing he remembered was clinging to a chain-link fence in rushing water, his fingers cramping from the effort of holding on, about to lose his grip as the current tried to rip him away. He had no memory of how he'd gotten from that fence to the park, couldn't explain the gap in his consciousness. No one had reported seeing him being rescued. One minute he was drowning, the next he was waking up dry and safe on a picnic table with no explanation. A teenage boy was swearing up and down to anyone who would listen that something huge and hairy had pulled him from a submerged car. He was adamant, almost desperate to make people believe him. His friends were patting his shoulder and nodding, but you could see in their eyes they thought he was exaggerating or confused. The kid kept saying it grabbed the car door and tore it off with one hand, pulled him out, and carried him to the roof of a house like he weighed nothing. Everyone was dismissing him as a traumatized kid making up stories, processing his fear through fantasy. 2 other survivors in different parts of the gym mentioned being carried to safety but couldn't describe who had helped them. One said it was all a blur, that she remembered hands lifting her and then nothing until she woke up somewhere dry. Another said he'd been unconscious the whole time, that he'd passed out from cold and exhaustion, and only knew someone had helped him because of where he woke up and the fact that he was still alive when by all rights he should have drowned. A woman in her 40s kept touching her arms like she could still feel where she'd been held, saying whoever saved her had been incredibly warm, that she remembered the warmth more than anything else, how it had felt like safety in the middle of chaos. I started connecting the dots in my mind, making mental notes of every story I heard. At least 6 or 7 people had these mysterious rescue stories, and those were just the ones I'd personally heard. There could have been more. People who were staying quiet because they didn't want to sound crazy, or people who genuinely didn't remember anything strange. All of them described the same basic details when you stripped away the individual variations. Something enormous, covered in dark hair, incredibly strong, and completely silent. None of them could explain with any clarity how they'd gotten from where they were trapped to where they were found. And all of them had been placed in safe locations, carefully positioned where other rescuers would eventually find them. Someone or something was staging rescues and then disappearing before anyone could identify them or thank them. It hit me then, sitting in that crowded gymnasium surrounded by hundreds of survivors, the smell of wet clothes and emergency rations in the air, the sound of crying children and worried conversations echoing off the walls. Something or someone was systematically rescuing people during the night and early morning hours when our teams couldn't reach everyone. Whatever it was moving through the flood with ease that we couldn't match, finding people who were trapped or unconscious in places we hadn't gotten to yet, and carrying them to safety with a care that suggested intelligence and compassion. It wasn't asking for recognition or acknowledgement. It wasn't stopping to talk to anyone or explain itself. It was just helping, then disappearing back into the darkness like it had never been there at all. By the third night, the water levels were finally starting to recede. We could see streets again, though they were still covered in inches or feet of water, and the debris was everywhere, making navigation treacherous. Furniture, pieces of houses, personal belongings, everything imaginable was scattered across the landscape. I volunteered for night patrol again, and I'll admit without shame that part of me was actively hoping to see that figure one more time. I needed to know if what I'd witnessed was real, if my eyes and my instincts could be trusted, or if I was experiencing some kind of breakdown that I needed to address before I put people in danger. I navigated my boat through the industrial area near the river, where the flooding had been absolute worst. This was where the water had risen highest, where buildings had collapsed under the pressure, where the current had been strongest during the peak of the flood. The water was still waist-deep in most places despite the receding, and the silence was thick and heavy like a physical presence. The moon was nearly full that night, casting everything in silver light that reflected off the water in patterns that seemed almost alive. Shadows moved and shifted with every ripple, making it hard to distinguish real movement from tricks of light. Around 2 a.m, when I'd been patrolling for hours without seeing anything unusual, I made a decision. I cut the boat motor completely and switched to paddling. I moved as quietly as I could, barely making a splash with each stroke, just listening to the night with every sense on high alert. The silence was profound. The moon painted everything silver and black, no shades of gray, just stark contrasts that hurt the eyes. My hands were cold on the paddle despite the relatively mild air temperature. That's when I heard it again. That same rhythmic splashing sound, heavy and purposeful, unmistakable once you'd heard it and knew what you were listening for. My heart started racing so hard I thought my chest might explode. I grabbed the night vision binoculars we kept for rescue operations, standard equipment that let us spot people in the dark, and scanned the area ahead with shaking hands. Through the green glow of the night vision, through the artificial light that made everything look alien and strange, I saw it clearly for the first time. Not a glimpse, not a shadow, not a trick of the light, but the actual creature in its full form. It was a Sasquatch. There's no other word for what I was seeing, no other way to describe it that would make any sense. The creature stood at least 8 feet tall, maybe more, maybe closer to 9 feet. Its body was covered in dark fur that looked almost black when wet, matted down by the water but still clearly thick and dense underneath. The muscles underneath that fur were obvious even from a distance, rippling with each movement. Through the binoculars, I could see details I'd missed before. Its arms were longer than human proportions, reaching past where its knees would be, ending in hands that looked powerful enough to crush stone. The shoulders were impossibly broad, wider than any human bodybuilder could achieve. Its head sat on those shoulders with barely any neck visible, and even through the night vision, I could see the shape of its face was different from ours, more protruding, more primitive. But what struck me most was the grace with which it moved. Despite its size, despite the obvious weight and power, it was wading through waist-deep water with clear purpose and surprising elegance, placing each massive foot carefully like a dancer, reading the water and the hidden debris below with what seemed like practiced ease. The Sasquatch was moving toward a partially collapsed building about 100 yards ahead, one of the old warehouses that dotted this industrial area. Half the building had fallen in on itself, and water was flowing through the broken windows and doors. I watched through the binoculars, barely breathing, as it approached the building and paused outside the largest opening. It seemed to be listening, tilting its head like it was processing sounds I couldn't hear. Then it ducked down and disappeared through a broken window, vanishing into the darkness of the collapsed structure. I followed at a distance of maybe 50 yards, keeping my motor off and moving as silently as possible with the paddle. Every instinct from my training was screaming that I should radio this in, report what I was seeing, get back up, follow protocol. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. I knew exactly how it would sound if I called in on the radio and said I was following a Bigfoot through the industrial district. They'd think I'd finally snapped, that the stress had broken something in my mind. They'd pull me off duty immediately, probably send someone to physically collect me and make sure I was okay. And more than that, something in my gut told me that this creature didn't want to be disturbed, that it was doing something important, and my interference might stop it or scare it away. So I just watched, positioning my boat where I had a clear view of the building, barely breathing, waiting to see what would happen next. 15 minutes passed. They felt like hours. I stayed exactly where I was, fighting the urge to move closer or call out or do anything that might reveal my presence. The water lapped gently against my boat, a rhythmic sound that normally would have been soothing, but now just made me more aware of every noise I was making. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear one of our other rescue teams working, their voices faint and distorted by distance, reminding me that the normal world still existed outside this surreal moment. I kept my binoculars trained on that broken window, watching for any sign of movement, any hint of what was happening inside that collapsed building. Then the Sasquatch emerged, and my breath caught so hard in my throat that I almost dropped the binoculars. It was carrying someone, an older man based on the build and the gray hair I could see clearly in the moonlight. The person was unconscious, completely limp in the creature's arms, head lolling back in a way that would have been concerning if not for the obvious care being taken. The Sasquatch held him like a parent carrying a sleeping child, one massive arm under the man's legs, the other supporting his back and shoulders. It cradled him with such gentleness that it was almost heartbreaking to witness, keeping his head carefully above water, supporting his entire weight as if he was no burden at all, despite probably weighing close to 200 pounds. I watched through the binoculars as the creature began walking, moving with that same careful grace through the flooded streets. It carried the man nearly 3 blocks, a distance that would have been challenging for me to walk through waist-deep water even without carrying anyone. It navigated obstacles I couldn't even see in the dark, avoiding submerged cars and fallen power lines with apparent ease, like it could sense them somehow. The whole time it kept checking the man's face, tilting its massive head down every few steps like it was monitoring his breathing, making sure he was okay, making certain it wasn't hurting him by accident with its incredible strength. The Sasquatch walked right up to our fire station, which was on high enough ground that only the bottom step was underwater. I watched in amazement as it climbed out of the water with surprising agility for something so large, its movement smooth and controlled, despite the awkward position of carrying someone. It climbed up onto the dry steps, and then, so gently it almost brought tears to my eyes, placed the unconscious man on the landing in front of the station's door. It arranged him carefully, making sure he was in a stable position, adjusting his arms and legs so he wouldn't roll or fall. Then it paused, for a long moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, The creature just stood there looking down at the man with an expression I couldn't read from this distance, but that seemed almost tender. It was assessing something, making sure of something, checking whether he was breathing properly, whether he was safe, whether its job was done. Satisfied with whatever it saw or sensed, it turned slowly and began walking back the way it had come, back toward the deeper water and the darkness that had hidden it before. I grabbed my radio with hands that were shaking so badly I almost dropped it in the water. I keyed the mic and called it in, trying to keep my voice steady and professional even though my heart was hammering against my ribs. I told my team there was an unconscious survivor on the fire station steps, that they needed to send medical immediately. When they asked how I knew, when they wanted details about who had dropped him off, I said I'd seen someone leave him there, but I didn't elaborate. I kept my report vague and brief. What could I say that wouldn't make me sound insane? Within minutes, responders arrived at the station in a rescue boat and found the man exactly where I'd said he'd be. He was hypothermic and dehydrated, but alive. No serious injuries, breathing on his own. He was rushed to medical care and made a full recovery over the next few days. When he was coherent enough to talk, when they asked him what he remembered, he had no memory of being rescued. No recollection of anything after the water started rising in the building where he'd been trapped trying to save some equipment from his business. His last memory was the water reaching his chest, and his next memory was waking up in a hospital bed surrounded by worried family. The floodwaters receded over the next few days, revealing the full extent of the damage to our town. Houses were destroyed or severely damaged, businesses were ruined, the landscape itself had been altered by the force of the water. Our team and teams from neighboring counties had performed dozens of rescues collectively, probably saving well over 100 lives through our coordinated efforts. But as I listened to the final reports and tallies being compiled, as I sat in debriefing meetings and heard the statistics being read aloud, I kept coming back to one specific number that no one else seemed to find significant. 9 people. 9 people had been mysteriously rescued and left in safe locations during the flood. All 9 were found alive and relatively unharmed. Most had no memory of their rescue or could only recall vague sensations and impressions. None had serious injuries beyond what you'd expect from being in floodwater. Some hypothermia, some scrapes and bruises, dehydration, shock. But they were alive when by all accounts they should have been dead, trapped in places where the water had risen too fast for them to escape on their own, and where our teams hadn't reached in time. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd witnessed, couldn't get the image of that Sasquatch out of my head. It played on repeat every time I tried to sleep. The way it moved through the water, the care with which it handled that unconscious man, the pause on the fire station steps like it was making sure its job was done right. The logical part of my brain kept trying to find alternative explanations, kept searching for some framework that would make this make sense within the world I thought I knew. But nothing fit. No human could be that large or that strong. No human could navigate flooded streets in pitch darkness without lights or equipment. No human could have accomplished what I'd witnessed. I started asking subtle questions around town over the following weeks, careful not to sound crazy or too interested, just curious about local history and folklore in a casual way. Had there ever been any stories about strange things in the woods around here? Any old legends about creatures or unexplained sightings? I framed it as idle curiosity, something to pass the time while we rebuilt the town and processed everything that had happened. Most people didn't have much to tell me, or they'd share generic stories about bears or coyotes. But a few older residents mentioned things that made my ears perk up, vague references to old stories that their grandparents had told them, tales that had been passed down through families but were usually dismissed as superstition or imagination. That's when I decided to visit the town's small historical society, which operated out of a back room in the library. The collection was modest but well maintained, boxes of old documents and photographs, journals and newspapers dating back to the town's founding. The woman who ran it was in her 70s, a retired school teacher who'd lived in this town her entire life, and whose family had been here for generations. When I asked her about local legends, being careful to sound academically curious rather than personally invested, her eyes lit up behind her reading glasses. She pulled out old journals and newspaper clippings with obvious excitement, some so old the paper was yellowing and fragile, and the stories she showed me made my spine tingle with recognition. There were accounts from the logging era in the early 1900s, detailed entries in journals kept by the logging camp supervisors. Multiple entries mentioned what they called the forest giant, describing it as something that supposedly helped lost loggers find their way back to camp when they'd gotten turned around in the dense woods. Several men over the years had reported being led through the woods at night by something large and dark that never spoke but seemed to know exactly where it was going. They described following this figure for miles, and it would lead them right back to camp before vanishing into the trees. At the time, people had written it off as exhaustion-induced hallucinations or tall tales told to explain getting lost, but the accounts were surprisingly consistent across different time periods and different witnesses. The indigenous people who had originally lived in this area had their own stories too, passed down through generations before being recorded by early settlers. They spoke of a protective spirit of the mountains, a guardian that watched over travelers and helped those in need. They had a name for it in their language, something that roughly translated to the gentle giant or the protector who walks. They said it had always been here, longer than any human settlement, and that it would help people who were lost or in danger but would never reveal itself fully. It was sacred to them, something to be respected and left alone, not hunted or captured or proven to exist. The librarian showed me documented accounts from the 1930s, Depression-era newspapers that reported on several hikers being led to safety by something they described as a large, hairy man who vanished as soon as they reached civilization. One particularly detailed account from July of 1974 told the story of a 7-year-old child who'd fallen into this very river during spring flooding. The child had been given up for dead when she was found alive on the bank a mile downstream, bruised and cold but otherwise unharmed. She told everyone who would listen that a big furry man had pulled her out of the water and carried her to safety. She described his hands as gentle despite being huge, said he'd wrapped her in something soft and warm. At the time, everyone had dismissed it as the imagination of a traumatized kid, the way young minds process fear and near-death experiences. But reading it now, knowing what I knew, the account felt eerily familiar. The pattern was undeniable once I started looking for it. For over a century, maybe longer, people in this area had been reporting encounters with something that protected them, helped them when they were in danger, and then disappeared without a trace. The stories were remarkably consistent when you looked past the individual variations and cultural interpretations. A large figure covered in hair, incredibly strong but gentle in its actions, moving silently through the wilderness, helping people in trouble, never seeking recognition or thanks. It never attacked anyone, never threatened anyone, never demanded anything. It simply helped those in need and vanished back into the wilderness where it apparently lived. A week after the floodwaters had completely receded, after the initial recovery efforts had transitioned into long-term rebuilding, I took a day off and returned to some of the sites where I'd seen those massive footprints during the flood. Most had been washed away by the receding water or trampled during the cleanup operations, but I had to try. Near the industrial area where I'd followed the Sasquatch that final night, where the water had been deepest, I found something. Several clear prints remained in dried mud that had been protected under an overhang, prints that the cleanup crews hadn't reached yet. I photographed them carefully from multiple angles, then measured them with a tape measure I'd brought specifically for this purpose. The prints were 18 inches long from heel to toe, showing 5 distinct toes with clear definition that suggested flexible feet adapted for climbing and rough terrain. They were much wider than any human foot I'd ever seen, easily twice as wide as my own size 11 boots. The depth of the impressions suggested incredible weight, probably 400 pounds or more. The stride length, when I measured between successive prints, suggested something at least 7 to 8 feet tall, possibly taller, walking with a gait that was humanoid but distinctly different from the way we move. I ventured into the nearby woods that bordered the industrial area, following old game trails and abandoned logging roads that dated back decades. The forest here was dense and old, with trees that had been growing for a century or more. I was looking for other signs, other evidence of what had been here during the flood. What I found convinced me beyond any remaining doubt that what I'd seen was absolutely real, and not any kind of hallucination or mistake. There were areas where branches had been broken at heights of 9 to 10 feet off the ground, snapped cleanly like someone very tall had pushed them aside while walking through. The breaks were recent based on the color of the exposed wood. I found what appeared to be bedding areas, places where something large had rested, depressions in the leaves and undergrowth that were roughly 7 feet long and 3 feet wide, shaped like a body. Near one such depression, I found a shelter of sorts, not built exactly, but a natural rock overhang that had clearly been used repeatedly. The ground underneath was flattened and cleared of rocks, with a pile of what looked like dried moss and leaves arranged almost like a mattress. The area was protected from wind and rain, positioned with a clear view of the valley below, surrounded by large trees that would provide cover and concealment. 2 weeks after the flood had completely ended, after most of the initial recovery work was done, and the town was beginning to return to some semblance of normal routine, I took another day off. I told my wife I was going fishing, which wasn't entirely a lie since I packed some fishing gear as cover. But what I really did was hike deep into the forest area alone, following the trails I'd found before and pushing even further into the wilderness. It was early morning on a weekday, a time when I knew I wouldn't encounter other hikers or hunters. The mist was still hanging in the trees, creating these beautiful but eerie curtains of white that drifted between the trunks. The world felt quiet and peaceful in a way it hadn't since before the disaster, like the forest itself was recovering from the trauma of the flood. I wasn't entirely sure what I was looking for. Closure, maybe. Confirmation that what I'd seen was real and not some stress-induced breakdown. Answers to questions I couldn't even fully articulate to myself. I just knew with absolute certainty that I needed to come here, to this place where the forest met the mountains, where the wilderness was still wild and untouched by human development. I sat down on a fallen log near a small creek, listening to the water bubble over smooth stones that had been polished by centuries of flow. I watched the mist drift slowly between the trees like it was alive. Birds were starting to sing their morning songs, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the rhythmic drumming of a woodpecker working on a dead tree. I closed my eyes and just breathed deeply, letting the peace of the forest wash over me, letting go of all the stress and trauma of the past few weeks. That's when I felt it, that unmistakable prickle on the back of my neck that told me I wasn't alone, that something was watching me. I opened my eyes slowly and caught movement in my peripheral vision, just at the edge of my awareness. There, standing about 40 yards away among the trees and morning mist, partially obscured by a massive oak trunk, but clearly visible if you knew where to look, was the Sasquatch. It stood perfectly still in a way that humans can't really manage, that complete stillness that wild animals have mastered. It was watching me with dark eyes that seemed impossibly ancient and somehow wise, like this creature had seen generations of humans come and go and understood something about life that we'd forgotten or never known. We looked at each other for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. The moment stretched and expanded, becoming something outside of normal time. I felt no fear this time, no shock or disbelief. Instead, I felt something like recognition, like I was in the presence of something important and old and deeply good, something that existed on a different level than the mundane world I normally inhabited. I spoke out loud, my voice barely above a whisper in the profound quiet of the forest. The words came without planning, driven by emotion I didn't fully understand. Thank you for helping those people. I don't know if you can understand me, but thank you. Thank you for saving those lives, for being there when we couldn't be, for caring about people you had no obligation to help. The Sasquatch didn't respond with sound, didn't make any noise that I could hear, but it shifted its weight slightly, a subtle movement that somehow conveyed attention and acknowledgement. And I could have sworn, though I'll never be completely certain, that it nodded its massive head ever so slightly. Or maybe it was just adjusting its posture, tilting its head to see me better through the trees. But something in that moment felt like acknowledgement, like we understood each other in a way that didn't require words or even a common language. It was communication on a deeper level, recognition passing between two beings who existed in very different worlds, but had briefly touched in a moment of crisis. Then, as smoothly and silently as water flowing over stones, as naturally as the mist drifting through the trees, the creature turned and walked deeper into the forest. Despite its enormous size, despite what must have been incredible weight, it moved without breaking a single branch, without disturbing the undergrowth in any noticeable way. It was like watching a ghost disappear into fog, there one moment and gone the next. Within seconds, it had vanished completely, swallowed by the forest that was clearly its home. I sat there for another hour, maybe longer, not really thinking, just being present in that space. I felt lighter somehow, like a weight I hadn't fully known I was carrying had been lifted from my shoulders. When I finally stood up to leave, my legs were stiff from sitting so long, but I felt more at peace than I had in weeks. I never filed an official report about the Sasquatch. How could I? I know exactly how it would be received, exactly what would happen to my career and my reputation. At best, people would think I was making up stories for attention, trying to get my 15 minutes of fame by jumping on the Bigfoot bandwagon. At worst, they'd question my fitness for duty, my mental stability, my ability to make sound decisions in high-stress situations. They'd probably force me into a psychological evaluation. They might put me on administrative leave pending the results. They might even suggest I retire early, that I'd been doing this job too long and the stress had finally broken something essential in my mind. I couldn't risk my career or my credibility as a first responder over something I couldn't prove with physical evidence, something that most people would never believe no matter how much testimony or documentation I could provide. But I did tell the story to a few trusted friends over the years, people I knew well enough to gauge their reaction. People who knew me well enough to know I wasn't prone to making things up. Some believed me, or at least believed that I believed what I was saying. They'd listen quietly, ask thoughtful questions, treat my account with respect even if they weren't sure what to make of it. Others were polite but clearly skeptical, nodding along but unable to hide the doubt in their eyes. And that's okay. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I'm not on a mission to prove Bigfoot exists or force anyone to believe in things they find impossible. I'm just sharing what I experienced, what I witnessed with my own eyes, and processed with my own mind during those 3 chaotic days in 1999 and in the weeks that followed. The official reports from the flood credit unknown Good Samaritans for several of the rescues. The county and the state wrote it off as neighbors helping neighbors, volunteers who didn't want recognition, ordinary people doing extraordinary things in a crisis. And maybe that's the story that makes everyone comfortable, the story that fits neatly into how we understand the world. But I know the truth. I know what really saved those 9 people, what carried them through deadly floodwaters that should have killed them, and placed them gently in safe locations where they could be found. I know what moved through our town during those 3 terrible nights, working alongside our emergency teams in its own way, helping where it could, doing its part to minimize the tragedy. I've continued my work as a firefighter in the years since, still responding to emergencies, still helping people in crisis, still doing the job I trained for and believe in. But now, when I'm called to remote areas near the forest, when I'm working in the wild places where the town meets the wilderness, I feel different. I feel watched over in a way I never did before. Protected somehow. Sometimes on quiet nights, when I'm doing a patrol near the edge of town or responding to a call in the woods, I look toward the tree line and wonder if it's out there, if it's watching, if it's still ready to help, if someone needs it the way those 9 people needed help during the flood. The skeptics will always say I was exhausted, that stress and lack of sleep created hallucinations, that there's a rational explanation for everything I saw if we just look hard enough. And maybe they're right about some of it. Maybe my mind filled in details that weren't quite accurate, or exaggerated things in memory the way human memory does. But those 9 people who were rescued are completely real. The historical accounts spanning over a century are real, documented in journals and newspapers and oral histories. The footprints I measured and photographed were real. The broken branches 9 feet off the ground were real. Something was there during those 3 days. Something moved through the flood with power and purpose, and that something helped us when we couldn't reach everyone in time. That's not hallucination or wishful thinking. That's documented reality, even if we can't explain it in terms that fit our current understanding of the world. Some things don't need scientific proof to be real. Some things exist whether we believe in them or not, whether we can measure and categorize them or not. The evidence is in those 9 people who walked away from the flood alive, who got second chances they shouldn't have had based on where they were trapped and how long it took us to reach those areas. The evidence is in the pattern of protective encounters that stretch back over 100 years in this one small area. The evidence is in the way I felt that morning in the forest, meeting the eyes of something ancient and good that wanted nothing from me except maybe understanding, maybe acknowledgement that it existed and had made a difference. And I'm one of the few people who've been trusted with this knowledge, who've been shown this truth that exists outside the boundaries of what we normally accept as possible. Whatever people want to call it, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the forest giant, the guardian of the mountains, the gentle protector, it was there during the flood of 1999, working alongside our emergency teams in its own way. It saved lives that would have been lost without its intervention. It carried people to safety who would have drowned in those flooded buildings and streets. And it asked for nothing in return except to be left alone to continue its quiet existence in these mountains, to maintain the privacy and peace it's apparently cultivated for generations or centuries, or however long it's been here. I consider myself incredibly lucky to have witnessed something most people never will, something that most people will go their entire lives never knowing exists. Lucky to have seen proof with my own eyes that we're not alone in these mountains, that something else lives here, something that's been here far longer than our towns and roads and buildings. Something that, for reasons I'll never fully understand, has chosen to protect us even though we've never acknowledged or thanked it properly for that protection. And that's my story. That's what I saw and experienced during those 3 days in the spring of 1999, and what I learned in the weeks and months that followed. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm not trying to prove anything or change anyone's mind about what's possible or impossible in this world. I'm just telling you what happened as truthfully and completely as I can, sharing my experience with whoever is willing to listen. 9 people were rescued by something that shouldn't exist according to everything we think we know about biology and evolution and the natural world. I saw it with my own eyes, followed it through flooded streets, watched it work. I met its gaze in a misty forest and felt understood in a way I can't quite explain, connected to something that exists outside the normal boundaries of human experience. That's all I can tell you. The rest is up to you to decide.